In medieval France, a pig was formally arrested and put on trial for murdering a child under the exact same procedure used for a human. Not a mob killing, a real court verdict. She was maimed the same way she had maimed the infant, dressed in a vest and trousers and hanged in the town square. Today, 10 medieval laws so bizarre you will not believe they were real. What else got put on trial? Let us go. Number 10. The pig on trial. Winter 1386. The town of Falaise in the Duchy of Normandy. A crowd gathers in the market square, the kind of crowd that comes for an execution. The condemned is led out on a rope, walking on 4 legs, not 2. It is a pig, and the story passed down afterwards says she was dressed for the occasion in a jacket, gloves, and breeches, cut and stitched to fit her body. To modern eyes, this looks like theater, like a strange medieval joke someone invented for a fair. It was not a joke. It was standard legal procedure, followed step by step, exactly as the law required. Medieval Christian thought held that every living creature existed inside one single moral order, placed there by God, answerable to the same laws that govern people. An animal was not seen as a blank, thoughtless machine, incapable of guilt. If a beast took a human life, the community needed more than a quiet burial and a farmer's apology. It needed a verdict delivered in public by a court, so that the natural order could be seen to right itself. Animals across medieval Europe fell fully under the same criminal courts as human beings. Not a symbolic trial, not a village custom acted out for entertainment. A real court, a real judge, a documented sentence, carried out to the letter, the same way it would be for any human defendant. Arrest, imprisonment, formal charges read aloud. A verdict handed down exactly as it would be for a person standing trial for murder. The case in Falaise had begun months earlier in a farmyard on the edge of town. A 3-month-old infant lay asleep in a wooden cradle, left unattended for only a moment. A sow wandered in from the yard outside. She attacked the sleeping child. The infant did not survive. Under the customs of the region, the sow was not treated as livestock that had simply misbehaved. She was treated as a defendant, with a name entered into the court record, exactly like a person. She was seized, chained, and held inside the town prison of Falaise to await trial, the same as any accused killer would be. The secular court of the city heard the case on the 9th of January. The same procedure used for a human murder charge was applied here, without shortcuts, without mercy for the accused's inability to understand a single word of it. Witnesses came forward. The facts were not really in dispute. The sow had killed the child in the cradle. Some records of animal trials elsewhere describe defendants, human and animal alike, receiving an appointed advocate to speak on their behalf, arguments entered, delays granted, appeals considered. Whether or not the sow in Falaise had someone speak for her, the court that judged her followed the same rhythm, the same paperwork, the same solemn weight, as any murder trial involving a person. The sentence was built to mirror the crime, in a way meant to be read as justice, not spectacle. Her front legs and her snout were to be mutilated first, the same injuries she had inflicted on the infant. Only then was she to be hanged in the public square, in front of the entire town. On the day of the execution, one detail is beyond doubt, because it was never left to storytellers to remember. It was written down in the town accounts of Falaise, in cold administrative ink. The executioner was paid 10 sous and 10 deniers for carrying out the sentence. A separate line covers a brand new pair of gloves, bought for the hangman himself. A line item in a ledger, for killing a pig exactly as though it had been a person. The jacket, the gloves on the sow, the breeches tailored to a 4-legged body, the painted church scene some tellers add for color. None of that comes from the Falaise court record itself. Historians who have gone back to the original document find no mention of a dressed pig, and no church painting at all, only the plain, colder fact of a formal sentence and a paid execution. Somewhere in the centuries between that ledger and today, A pig hanged for murder turned into a pig hanged in a little suit, and the second version is the one every retelling keeps. Here is the detail that should stop you. This was not one strange village superstition, acted out once and forgotten by everyone involved. Trials like this one for pigs, for bulls, for rats, even for insects, continued across Europe for centuries after Falaise. They did not fade out until well into the 1700s, only disappearing alongside the slow decline of the old church courts and secular courts that had once handled them. For close to 400 years, animals stood in the dock like citizens, facing judges, facing formal sentences, facing the very same rope as any condemned person. Sit with that for a moment. A pig was arrested, imprisoned, tried, and hanged, with a paid receipt to prove the sentence was really carried out. And if the law was willing to do all of that to a farm animal that could not understand a single word of the charges against it, ask yourself what that same law was willing to do to a person who broke its rules on purpose. There is a colder question underneath the obvious one. Was a trial like this one really about the dead infant at all? Or was it about a frightened community, needing to watch order restored, needing to see a guilty party walk to the gallows, even if the guilty party could not understand a single charge read against it? A pig-standing trial like a person, dressed or not, made a very convincing stand-in for control, in a world that could not otherwise explain why a child in a cradle was no longer alive. The next law on this list did not stop at a rope around the neck. It rewrote what a human face was allowed to look like, one government decree at a time. Number 9. The Slit-Nose Law, Constantinople 726. Inside the imperial palace, scribes copy out a new legal code by torchlight, one clause at a time. This is the Ecloga, issued jointly by Emperor Leo III, known as the Isaurian, and his son and co-ruler Constantine V. Every phrase they approve tonight will decide, years from now, exactly what happens to a stranger's body for a private mistake. It reads less like a legal reform and more like a warning carved permanently into Roman law. Leo III had taken the throne nearly a decade earlier, after seizing power amid war and instability across the empire. A new dynasty needed to look strong, decisive, capable of reordering not just armies and borders, but the private lives of its own people. Rewriting the penalties for what happened inside a bedroom was one way of proving that reach. Earlier Roman law had punished many sexual offenses with death. The Ecloga changed that, but not toward mercy in any way we would recognize today. It replaced execution in case after case with mutilation, a punishment the offender would carry on his face for the rest of his life, in front of everyone he ever met again. The wording is direct, almost clinical, with none of the softening language you might expect from a religious empire. A man who has relations with a woman who has taken vows as a nun commits, in the language of the code, a vile act of adultery against someone who belongs to the church. His punishment, spelled out plainly in the text, is to have his nose cut off. Roman emperors before Leo had punished offenses like these with the sword, a fast, final, almost merciful end compared to what came next. The same penalty applied far beyond that one case. A man who slept with his godmother, or a woman who slept with her godson, faced the same mutilation. So did cases the code classified as incest, a father with his daughter-in-law, a stepson with his stepmother, a man involved with two sisters or two cousins at once. And if a husband knew his wife was committing adultery and chose to look away, tolerating it rather than reporting it, the law punished both husband and wife together, with the same disfigurement. Picture what that meant on a crowded Byzantine street, years after the sentence was carried out. A slit nose was not a private shame, hidden behind closed doors and quiet apologies. It was permanent, visible, unmissable, a face reshaped by the state as a public record of exactly what its owner had once done. Everyone who looked at that face for the rest of that person's life would know precisely why it looked that way. Consider what a slit nose did beyond the physical wound itself. In a culture built around honor, status, and public appearance, it functioned as a kind of walking confession, one the condemned could never take off, never explain away, never outlive. A death sentence ends. A slit nose does not. It keeps punishing every single day for as long as the condemned keeps breathing. This is the detail worth sitting with. This was not the personal cruelty of one harsh judge, handing down an improvised punishment in a fit of anger on a single afternoon. This was written into an official, empire-wide legal code, applied as standard procedure, case after case, across the entire Byzantine world. Nose-slitting sat in the same legal universe as blinding, another mutilation Byzantine rulers used constantly, though usually against political rivals rather than ordinary citizens caught in bed with the wrong person. A society willing to blind a rival claimant to the throne without much debate also kept on its books a precise tariff of noses for offenses far more mundane than treason. Ask which crime the empire seemed to fear more, a threat to the throne or a broken vow of celibacy. The law on paper priced them almost the same in mutilation, in permanence, in public shame. There is a colder layer underneath all of this too. The Ecloga was, in its own strange way, marketed at the time as an act of mercy. Death sentences were being replaced by punishments that let the condemned keep breathing. Officials of the era may genuinely have viewed a slit nose as leniency, compared to a headsman's blade across the neck. Ask the person living the rest of their life with that disfigurement whether it ever felt like mercy to them. The Ecloga remained in force for close to 150 years. It was not overturned until the late 9th century, when the Macedonian dynasty issued new legal codes, the Poachers and later the Basilica, restoring parts of the older, gentler Roman legal tradition. Even then, mutilation itself did not disappear from Byzantine punishment. Blinding in particular stayed in use for a long time afterward, especially as a way of destroying a political rival's claim to power without the mess of a public execution. For an ordinary person living under the Ecloga, walking past a man with no nose was not unusual, not shocking, simply part of the visible landscape of the empire. A permanent ledger of sins, the state had decided to punish this way, instead of with a blade to the neck. If slicing off a nose for a private affair sounds severe, hold that thought for one more law. The next entry on this list did not touch a person's face at all. It went after something the empire that wrote it considered even more valuable, a man's own eyesight, over nothing more than a deer standing in the wrong forest. Number 8. Blinded for a deer. Somewhere in the New Forest in southern England, under a canopy of ancient oak trees, sunlight breaking through the leaves in narrow shafts. A hunter freezes, a deer carcass at his feet, footsteps approaching from behind through the undergrowth. He is not facing a fine. He is facing the loss of his own eyes. There is no court date to argue his case, no plea to enter, no appeal waiting further up the chain. After the Norman conquest of 1066, England's kings carved out huge stretches of countryside and declared them royal forest, starting under William I, known as the Conqueror, and expanding for decades afterward under his heirs. Forest did not mean wilderness in the way we picture it now. It meant land, including entire villages, farms, and churches, placed under a completely separate legal system, built entirely around protecting the king's game. Local people who had hunted these same woods for generations, feeding their families the same way their fathers and grandfathers had, woke up one day to find that the ground under their feet now belonged to a different set of rules entirely. Rules that valued the animals around them more than the people walking past. Inside forest boundaries, ordinary English law simply stopped applying, as though a different country had been drawn on top of the old one. A new code, known as forest law, took over instead, and it treated the king's deer as more legally protected than most of his human subjects. Harming a royal deer, in any way at any stage, was not treated as theft or trespass. It was treated as a crime against the crown itself. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, William decreed that anyone who killed a hart or a hind was to be blinded. Read that again. Simple poaching, killing one deer for food to feed a hungry family, could cost a person their sight permanently by royal order. The punishment scaled with the offense but never scaled down to something as ordinary as a fine. Merely disturbing the king's game, startling a deer, driving it off before a hunt could even begin, could cost a man a hand or his eyes, depending on the severity a court assigned. Killing game repeatedly or resisting the foresters sent to enforce the law could escalate all the way to execution. None of this applied to the king himself or to nobles hunting with his blessing. The same forest, the same deer, the same trees, meant something completely different depending on whose hand held the bow. The human cost went beyond individual poachers, too. Chroniclers writing soon after the new forest was created claimed that entire churches and villages inside its new boundaries were torn down, their land converted into open pasture and woodland for deer to roam freely. Modern historians looking at the actual land records think the truth is smaller than the legend. Some farms really were cleared out for the king's hunting ground, just nowhere near as many as the old stories claim. Even the more modest, better documented version is still a strange thing for a king to have done, clearing out working farms so animals he wanted to hunt could have more room to graze undisturbed. Here is where the story gets more complicated and more honest. Many modern historians now treat the Chronicle's account of William personally decreeing blinding as at least partly anti-Norman propaganda, written by English chroniclers who had every reason to paint the conqueror as a monster. What is not disputed is that the system of mutilation as punishment for poaching was firmly in place and actively enforced under his son, William II, known as Rufus, and continued further under Henry I afterward. Whether William himself invented the harshest version of the law, or his successors hardened it after his death, the outcome for an ordinary poacher stayed the same, permanent darkness for the crime of feeding his own family. Whichever version is closer to the truth, one thing does not change. Somewhere in that forest, a hungry man made a choice most people today would barely think twice about, and paid for it with his sight for the rest of his life. Forest law did not vanish quickly. It stayed on the books for centuries, eventually reined in by the Charter of the Forest in 1217, a companion document to Magna Carta that finally rolled back some of the Crown's harshest forest privileges. Even that reform came only after generations of resentment, petitions, and quiet defiance from people who had watched their neighbors lose eyes and hands over animals they were never allowed to touch. Even after that, remnants of the system lingered inside English law all the way into the 19th and 20th centuries before being fully abolished for good. There is a bitter irony sitting underneath all of it. A king who ruled over millions of human subjects built an entire parallel justice system, complete with mutilation and execution, to protect animals he wanted to hunt purely for sport. A deer, in the eyes of that law, was worth more than an ordinary man's eyes. Think about what that says about the world these people lived in. A world where a hart grazing quietly under royal oaks carried more legal protection than the peasant standing a few feet away, watching it, hungry and forbidden even to look at it the wrong way. If trading a person's sight for a king's hunting ground sounds like the furthest medieval law would go to protect its own interests, wait until you hear what happened to a man in Iceland who simply said the wrong 3 words out loud. Number 7. Words that kill. Iceland, sometime between the 10th and 13th centuries, at a gathering of the Althing, the island's open-air assembly of free men, wind cutting across open volcanic ground. Two men stand facing each other in front of witnesses, tension building before anyone has thrown a single punch. Neither one has raised a fist yet. In this legal system, a fist was never really the dangerous part. One of them says three specific words. The words themselves are almost absurdly short, three plain syllables a child could learn in an afternoon, yet carrying more legal weight than most contracts drawn up in the medieval world. By the time he finishes the sentence, the man he insulted may already be as good as dead under the law. No blade has been drawn yet. No blood has been spilled. Only three words spoken out loud in front of the right people. Medieval Iceland during this period had no king, no standing army, no central police force to keep order. Order came instead from reputation, from the threat of violence a man could credibly promise, and from law codes memorized and recited aloud by trained law speakers at every gathering of the Althing, since almost nothing was written down in the earliest years. Instead, it ran on an enormous, detailed body of law known as gragas, sometimes translated as the Grey Goose, written down and enforced through the Althing rather than any single ruler. Buried inside that code sat one of the strangest speech laws in medieval history. Gragas named three specific insulting words, spelled out precisely in the text, not left open to interpretation by an angry judge. All three accused a man of playing what the culture considered the passive, so-called feminine role in sex, or accused him outright of cowardice in battle. Say any one of those three words about another free man, and the law did not treat it as a minor slur to be shrugged off. It treated it as an act serious enough to justify the harshest punishment Icelandic law had, full outlawry, meaning the man who spoke it could be killed by the very man he had insulted, without legal consequence for the killer. Outlawry was not exile in any gentle sense of the word. It stripped a man of every legal protection Icelandic society offered. Feeding him, sheltering him, even speaking to him without cause, could bring trouble down on anyone who tried. He became, in the eyes of the law, no different from an animal that could be hunted without punishment. Now here is the twist that makes this law genuinely strange, even by medieval standards. The law did not wait for a court to weigh the truth of an insult before punishing it. Speaking one of those three words about a free man was, by itself, already the crime, whether the accusation was true or not. The moment those words left his mouth, in front of witnesses, the speaker had made himself a legal target. Icelandic law handed the insulted man something rarer than a lawsuit. He did not need to file a claim or wait for the Althing to rule on anything. He could kill the man who insulted him on the spot, and the law treated it as no crime at all. Notice what that arrangement actually protects. It is not simply whoever speaks first and loudest. The law hands real, immediate power to the man on the receiving end of an insult, and puts every risk onto the tongue that started it. Sit with what that actually means. Three spoken words, with no evidence required, no witnesses cross-examined, no trial for the accusation itself, could turn the man who said them into a corpse before the assembly even broke up for the day. A single insult, shouted across a crowded hall or muttered quietly at a gathering, could carry the same weight as a death sentence, carried out immediately, by the very man it was aimed at. Public reputation in this world was not just social currency to be spent carefully. Calling another man weak or cowardly was not just an insult. It was closer to picking up a weapon and pointing it at your own chest. Words were not just words in Iceland. They doubled as a license to kill, and everyone at the assembly knew it. The formal dueling system, Holmgang itself, had for generations been the way these insults got settled face to face, until it was banned by law around 1006, and the law began handing out that same deadly right without any duel required at all. But the insult clauses inside gragas did not disappear along with the duel. They stayed on the books, still fully enforceable, until Iceland adopted an entirely new law code known as Jonsbok in 1281. For roughly 2.5 centuries, the wrong three words spoken about the wrong man in front of the wrong witnesses could end with someone legally, officially dead. 2.5 centuries is a long time for a society to keep agreeing that language itself deserved a death penalty, longer than most kingdoms on this list managed to keep any single law unchanged at all. If an insult could carry a death sentence in Iceland, the next law on this list priced something even stranger, not a man's reputation, but the individual hairs on his own face, and it valued them more than his own severed finger. Number 6. The beard fine. Kievan Rus, a world governed by a sprawling legal code known as Russkaya Pravda. Its oldest core linked to Yaroslav the Wise in the 11th century, later expanded further across the 12th. Every dispute, from a stolen cow to a broken jaw, was expected to end not in a blood feud, but in a payment, written down and settled. Picture a tavern or a crowded market, tempers rising fast, and one man grabbing a fistful of another man's beard in front of onlookers. It probably felt, in the heat of the moment, like a small, almost childish act of aggression, over in a second, forgotten by the next morning by anyone except the two men involved. Under this law, that single act was not a minor scuffle to be laughed off later. It was a priced offense, with an exact number attached, written into the same code that covered murder itself. There was no room for a judge to decide the beard grab did not really matter, no room for the other man to simply laugh it off in front of witnesses. Russkaya Pravda did not emerge from nothing. It drew on older Slavic customary law, on Byzantine legal ideas filtering north through trade and the church, and on the practical need of a young, sprawling state to settle disputes with coin, instead of endless blood feuds between families. Russkaya Pravda is famous among historians for how granular it gets. It laid out a detailed price list of fines for specific insults and injuries, working down from killing a person all the way to plucking out a single strand of hair. Almost nothing was left to a judge's personal improvisation. Nearly every harm imaginable had its own fixed number, agreed upon in advance, sitting in the text waiting to be applied. A killing carried one number. A wound that drew blood carried another. Knocking out a tooth, breaking a bone, striking a man with the flat of a sword instead of the edge, each had its own separate line, its own separate price, as though violence itself had been organized into a catalog. Here is the detail worth sitting with. Ripping out a clump of another free man's beard or mustache carried a fine of 12 silver coins. That is not a small sum in this legal world, not something a poor man could shrug off. It is the exact same fine set for cutting off one of a man's fingers entirely, permanently, with a blade. Read the two crimes side by side, and they do not look like they belong in the same category at all. One leaves a man permanently unable to hold a tool properly for the rest of his life. The other leaves him, in a matter of weeks, simply growing his beard back. Now compare that to the price of the finger itself on its own in isolation. Losing an actual finger, a permanent, physical, irreversible injury, carried a compensation of only 3 silver coins. Read those two numbers side by side slowly. Grabbing a man's beard cost 4 times more in the eyes of the law than physically removing part of his hand for good. Pause on that comparison for a second time. A permanent, visible, physical disability, priced at 3 silver coins. A temporary growing back insult to a man's pride, priced at 12. Whoever wrote this table of fines was not measuring damage to the body. They were measuring damage to a man standing among his neighbors. This was not a drafting accident, and not a strange quirk nobody noticed. In this culture, a man's beard was not simply facial hair growing on his chin. It stood for his honor, his adult standing, his masculinity in the eyes of his entire community. Touching it, pulling it, Humiliating a man through his beard in public struck at something the law considered more valuable than flesh and bone combined. A missing finger healed into a story told at a tavern. A shamed beard, apparently, cut far deeper than any blade. There is something almost modern in that logic, even if the number attached to it feels bizarre today. Reputation, in Kievan Ruse, was treated as an asset with a real, calculable value, something the law was prepared to protect with the same seriousness it protected a man's own body. There is a strange kind of logic hiding underneath the strangeness of it all. Medieval law across many cultures treated honor as a real, protected asset, almost like property, sometimes worth defending more fiercely than the physical body itself. Russkaya Pravda simply wrote that logic down in cold, exact numbers, 12 silver coins against 3, for anyone to read on the page. 12 silver coins could buy quite a lot in this world: livestock, land, the loyalty of hired men. Handing over that much money because you grabbed a beard in anger, rather than because you cut off a finger with a blade, tells you exactly what medieval Ruse society was most afraid of losing. The code did not vanish quickly either. Russkaya Pravda remained the governing law across Ruse territories for centuries, only gradually replaced by the pseudobniks of the Moscow state, issued in 1497 and again in 1550, and by the Lithuanian statutes, which slowly took over across the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. For all those centuries, the message stayed the same, whispered into every dispute settled under this code: touch a man's body carelessly, and you owe him a modest sum. Touch his honor, even for a moment, and you owe him 4 times as much. For hundreds of years on paper, a man's beard was worth more than his own finger. But losing a finger for a fistful of torn beard was, at least, over in a single moment of pain. Next came a law that stretched its punishment out much further, weighing an entire death against a mountain of grain, over nothing more than a king's favorite barn cat. Number 5. The king's cat. Picture a stone floor inside a royal grain store in Wales, swept clean for the occasion, and a cat's body laid gently upon it, nose down, tail pulled straight up into the air by a steady hand. Around that small, still shape, a man begins pouring wheat grain, handful by handful, watching the mound climb higher and higher toward the tip of the raised tail. This was not a burial rite, and it was not superstition. It was a court sentence carried out to the letter of a written law. The law belonged to King Hywel the Good, ruler of the kingdom of Deheubarth in the south of Wales. Sometime around 945, Hywel called together the judges and scribes of his land and ordered the scattered customs of Wales gathered into a single code. The original texts did not survive, but copies did, written out again in manuscripts from the 12th and 13th centuries. Through those later copies, we can still read exactly what Hywel's judges valued and exactly how they chose to measure it. What they valued, among a great many other things, was the cat. Not a pet curled by the hearth for comfort, but a working animal with a real job on the royal estate, guarding sacks of grain from the mice and rats that could ruin a season's harvest in a single night. A rodent problem in a medieval storehouse was never a minor inconvenience. Left unchecked, it could tip a household or an entire estate toward hunger before the next planting. So the crown placed a formal price on the animal standing between the granary and disaster, and wrote that price directly into law. This was only one thread in a much larger tapestry. Hywel's code did not simply mention animals in passing. It ran on for page after page, assigning exact values to almost everything a household might own, from a plow ox to a lapdog, from a stolen glove to an injured finger. Each value scaled to the object's use and its owner's rank, so no dispute needed to be settled by guesswork or by the loudest voice in the room. The cat clause was not an eccentric footnote tucked into the margins. It was simply the code being exactly as thorough with a barn animal as it was with a nobleman's horse. If someone killed a royal storehouse cat or stole it away, the punishment was not some flat fine invented on the spot. It was calculated, animal by animal, grain by grain. The dead or missing cat was laid on a level, clean floor, nose to the ground, tail lifted and held straight up. The guilty party then had to pour wheat over the body slowly, until the grain covered the very tip of that raised tail. Witnesses standing near enough could hear the grain hissing softly as it fell, an oddly gentle sound for something functioning as a criminal punishment. Every measure of wheat needed to bury the tail completely was the compensation owed to the crown. A larger cat with a longer tail meant a costlier crime. A young kitten meant a smaller mound. The animal's own body had become the measuring stick for its worth. The code did not stop at punishing theft. It also described with real precision what made a cat worth this kind of protection in the first place. A proper storehouse cat had to see clearly and hear well. It had to actually catch mice, not merely lounge near the grain sacks. It needed a full, undamaged set of claws, since a clawless cat could hardly do its work. And it had to be capable of raising kittens of its own, keeping the next generation of mousers coming. If a cat sold under this standard failed to meet it, the buyer was owed back a third of what they had paid. Medieval Wales, in other words, had written something close to a warranty for cats, long before anyone thought to write one for a plow horse. Sit with that for a moment. This was not folklore whispered by a fireside. It was formal statute, copied out by careful hands into law books meant to be argued over in real courtrooms by real judges. A kingdom that could go to war over cattle raids and border disputes also sat down and worked out, to the exact grain, what a barn cat's tail was worth in wheat. That is not the mark of a lawless age stumbling through the dark. It is the mark of an order that reached further into ordinary life than most people today would ever guess, all the way down to the family cat guarding the family's food. Ask how many legal systems today could produce, on demand, an exact formula for what a single household pet is worth. Hywel's judges could, without hesitation, in grains of wheat. Hywel Dda's code did not fade quickly once it was written. It stood as the backbone of Welsh law for more than 3 centuries, cited and copied and debated in courts across Wales long after Hywel himself was gone. Its authority only truly cracked when Edward I of England conquered Wales between 1282 and 1284, sealing the defeat with the Statute of Rhuddlan. Even then, Welsh custom did not disappear overnight. It lingered on in pockets for generations, slowly pushed aside by English common law, until the Acts of Union between 1536 and 1543 finally folded Wales into England's legal system for good. So a law born to protect a working cat in a Welsh granary outlived kings, outlived a war of conquest, and very nearly outlived the independent kingdom that first wrote it down. If a crown cared this deeply about the worth of a cat's tail, it is fair to wonder what it was willing to measure inside a marriage bed. In Ireland, it turns out the answer is almost everything. Number 4. The fat husband clause. Somewhere in early medieval Ireland, a woman stands before a judge trained in the old legal schools, listing the reasons her marriage is over. She is not pleading for mercy or begging for an exception. She is reciting grounds that the law itself already recognizes, grounds written down, taught, and memorized for generations. One of those grounds, spoken plainly and without embarrassment, is that her husband has grown too fat to perform his marital duties. This comes from the Brehon law, the great body of native Irish legal tradition that shaped daily life across Ireland for centuries. Within it sits a specific text called Cain Lanamna, the law of couples, composed around the year 700 by Irish legal scholars trained in schools that treated law as both craft and inheritance. Brehon law kept its authority in Ireland for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, remaining in active use right up until the English conquest, and its slow replacement by English common law across the 16th and 17th centuries. Brehon law as a whole gave Irish women a level of legal standing that many neighboring kingdoms did not extend to women at all. Wives could hold property independently of their husbands, could inherit, and could walk away from a marriage that failed to meet its obligations without losing everything they had brought into it. Cain Lanamna sat at the center of that wider system, spelling out precisely what a marriage owed each partner, and precisely what happened the moment one side stopped delivering. What makes Cain Lanamna so striking is not simply that it allowed divorce. Plenty of medieval legal systems allowed for some form of separation. What makes it remarkable is how lopsided and how specific the grounds were. The text recognizes 14 separate grounds on which a wife could legally divorce her husband and keep her portion of the couple's property. A husband, by contrast, had only 7 grounds available to him. In a marriage landscape usually remembered as overwhelmingly stacked in favor of men, Irish law had quietly built in twice as many legal exits for women as for their husbands. Some of those 14 grounds are exactly what you would expect from any legal system of the period. Infidelity counted. So did a husband's inability to father children, and so did impotence, both treated as serious enough to end a marriage outright. But the list does not stop at the expected. It keeps going into territory that feels startlingly modern and startlingly personal. The text does not simply list these grounds in passing either. It discusses each one with enough legal nuance for a judge to actually apply it in a real dispute, weighing intention, capacity, and harm the way a modern court might weigh negligence or a broken contract. Here is the detail worth pausing on. Among the recognized grounds for a wife to divorce her husband was that he had become too fat to have marital relations with her. Not merely overweight in some vague, judgmental sense, but physically incapable of fulfilling the marriage because of his own size. The law did not treat this as a joke or an insult. It treated it as a legitimate failure of a husband's basic duty, worthy of legal remedy, worthy of a woman walking away with her property intact. And there is a second ground almost as sharp. A wife could also divorce a husband who gossiped about their intimate life, who talked publicly about what happened between them in bed. The old text is blunt about where such a man belonged. A man who talks about the bed does not deserve to lie under the blanket. In a culture usually imagined as silent and closed around anything intimate, Irish law was carving out a clear right to privacy inside marriage and punishing the husband who violated it by ending the marriage on his wife's terms. It is worth pausing on how unusual that protection was for its time. Long before ideas of marital privacy found a place in most Western legal traditions, Irish law had already decided that a husband's loose tongue was itself a form of injury, serious enough to end a marriage, placing a wife's dignity on the same legal footing as her husband's fidelity. Think about what that means placed beside the more familiar grounds. Impotence sits on the same list as excess weight and loose talk, all treated as breaches serious enough to dissolve a legal union. This was not a system improvising sympathy case by case. It was a codified, taught, and cited body of law, studied in schools, applied by trained judges, carried in the memory of legal families across generations. The scandal here is not that medieval Ireland had strange ideas about marriage. The scandal is how carefully, how deliberately, those ideas were written into enforceable law, and how much practical protection they actually handed to wives. Brehon law did not vanish the moment English soldiers arrived. It continued to function in Irish communities for a long stretch after conquest, taught and applied even as English rule tightened its grip. Colonial administrators gradually declared it illegitimate, chipping away at its authority piece by piece, until English common law finally displaced it completely by the close of the 16th century, and the opening years of the 17th. A legal tradition that had protected wives from overweight, gossiping husbands for nearly 900 years was replaced by a system that offered women far less room to walk away. Under the English common law that followed, a wife typically could not simply divorce a husband for growing too heavy or for talking too freely about their marriage. Doors that had stood open under Brehon law closed in most places for centuries. If a marriage bed could be regulated down to a husband's waistline and his loose tongue, it should come as no surprise that a kingdom's fashion sense could be regulated too. In England, lawmakers were about to take aim at something far less private than a marriage. They were about to take aim at shoes. Number 3. The 2-inch shoe. Walk through an English town in the middle of the 1400s, and you will see feet that look almost impossible. Shoes stretch out into long, needle-thin points, sometimes reaching several inches beyond where the toes actually end, curling upward like tiny horns. Some of these points are stuffed with moss or wool just to hold their shape. On the most extreme pairs, a thin chain runs from the tip of the shoe up to the wearer's knee, so the point does not drag on the ground and trip its owner mid-stride. This was not a costume. This was fashion, and it had gotten completely out of hand. Cobblers across English towns built entire businesses around these points, competing to stretch leather further than the shop next door dared to try. Preachers complained from the pulpit that young men spent more thought on the length of their shoes than on the state of their souls, singling the fashion out by name as proof that vanity had gone too far. The shoes were called poulains, sometimes known as krakows, and by the middle of the 15th century they had become the loudest possible statement a person could make with their feet. The longer and sharper the point, the more fashionable, and often the more expensive the shoe. Parliament finally decided enough was enough. In 1463, under King Edward IV, England passed a statute aimed directly at footwear. The law was specific almost to the point of absurdity. Anyone who was not a lord or a gentleman of rank was forbidden from wearing shoes with a point longer than 2 inches measured from the tip of the toe. 2 inches, no more. A lord or a gentleman of standing could wear whatever length he liked. Everyone else had a ruler quietly built into the law governing their footwear. Parliament did not simply ban the shoes outright. It built a ladder of allowance instead, matching the length of an acceptable point to the wearer's place in society, so that a person's rank could be read from the ground up before a single word was exchanged. Here is the detail worth sitting with. This was never really about comfort or safety or practicality, even though officials sometimes framed it that way. It was about status made visible at a glance. In a world without name tags or uniforms for every rank, the length of a shoe's point had become a silent signal of who a person was, or who they were pretending to be. A merchant or a lesser gentleman wearing a lord-length point was, in effect, lying with his feet. Lawmakers were not going to let footwear undercut the entire visible order of society. How many other laws, across how many other centuries, have tried to legislate away the gap between how rich a person actually is and how rich they look? 1463 was hardly the last time a government tried. But there was a second, sharper edge to the outrage. The exaggerated point of a poulain carried an unmistakable and deliberate resemblance to certain parts of the male body, and medieval writers and preachers noticed, and said so, loudly. Wearing an overly long point was not just seen as vanity or overreach of rank. It was tied to accusations of open indecency, the shoe itself treated as something close to a public display. Parliament was not merely policing fashion trends. It was treating the shape of a shoe as a matter of public morality, worth writing into the same kind of statute used for far graver offenses. Cutting the point off at 2 inches was, in that light, as much about controlling appetite and pride as it was about controlling cloth and leather. A shoe had become a confession, whether its wearer meant it that way or not. England was not even first to try this. Nearly a century earlier, in 1368, King Charles V of France had already issued his own decree targeting the same exaggerated points, worried about the same tangle of vanity, status, and indecency. The fashion crossed borders easily, moving faster across medieval frontiers than most goods or ideas of the period ever did. So, it turned out, did the impulse to legislate against it, with lawmakers on more than one side of the channel, fighting the very same battle over the very same few inches of leather. The pressure worked, slowly. Poulains began falling out of favor in the final quarter of the 1400s, squeezed by repeated legal restrictions and by a genuine shift in taste. Guild wardens and town officials were tasked with checking hems and toes at markets and fairs along the way, adding one more small, tedious duty to the already long list of things medieval officials were expected to measure. By the opening years of the 16th century, fashionable Europe had swung to the opposite extreme entirely, trading needle-sharp points for wide, almost square-toed shoes. The pendulum of medieval footwear had swung as far as it could go in the other direction, and lawmakers, for once, could stop measuring toes. It is easy to laugh at a parliament debating the exact number of inches a shoe was allowed to stretch beyond a person's foot. But look at what that law actually reveals. A government willing to regulate the shape of a shoe down to a precise measurement was a government that understood exactly how much power lived in appearance, in cloth, in silhouette. A ruler that could regulate 2 inches of leather could just as easily decide 2 inches meant nothing at all. The moment fashion moved on without asking permission. Nowhere was that understanding sharper or stranger than in the streets of Florence, where officials did not stop at shoes. They started counting buttons. Number 2. The button police. In Florence, a city famous for wealth, art, and ambition, a woman getting dressed in the privacy of her own home was not entirely free from the reach of the law. Her sleeves, her neckline, the trim on her gown, and even the small pieces of metal or glass fastening her bodice closed could all, in theory, be measured, judged, and fined by an official whose entire job was to police exactly that. Florence was hardly alone in trying to legislate fashion. City after city across late medieval Italy passed similar restrictions, worried that unchecked spending on clothes would blur the line between old noble families and newly wealthy merchants. Few cities pursued the project with quite the bureaucratic determination that Florence did. This grew out of Florence's sumptuary laws, a wave of legislation across the 1300s designed to restrain public displays of wealth and, very specifically, to control what women could wear. One decree from 1356 laid out the rules in exacting detail. Women were forbidden from wearing buttons made of enamel, glass, pearl, or precious stone. Not just a handful of buttons either, but the material of the button itself, regulated by name. And crucially, these rules did not stop at the front door. The law applied even to clothing worn privately inside a woman's own home, not only what she wore walking through the piazza. Later decrees kept expanding the list further still, reaching into fabric, fur trim, veils, and hair jewelry with each new round of legislation, as though the city could never quite stop finding one more detail worth regulating. To enforce all of this, Florence did something almost nobody expects from a medieval city. It created an entire specialized office dedicated to the task, a body of officials known as the Officiali del Don, the officials of women. Their job, stated plainly, was to oversee what Florentine women wore and to punish what broke the rules. The office did not operate quietly in the background either. Its officials could stop a woman in the street, in church, or at a wedding, and demand a closer look at what she had on, treating public appearance as a matter open to inspection at almost any moment. Here is the detail worth sitting with. These were not soldiers or judges handling occasional complaints. Their actual documented duty was patrolling the markets, the piazzas, even the doors of the cathedral, checking what women were wearing against a code that spelled out buttons, gown trains, and necklines in exact detail. A government office existed whose daily function was walking the city and deciding whether a woman's clothing broke the law. Imagine the administrative effort behind that. Someone had to be trained to recognize the difference between a plain glass button and a jeweled one at a glance, then write up the violation, assess the fine, and move on to the next dress in the crowd. And the city gave ordinary Florentines a tool to help. Anonymous denunciation boxes stood ready to receive tips from neighbors willing to report a woman's overly fine dress, turning fashion policing into something close to a civic sport. Florentine women, for their part, did not simply comply. They studied the wording of each new decree as closely as any lawyer, hunting for loopholes, wearing garments that technically obeyed the letter of the rule while completely defeating its spirit. A band fabric might reappear as a lining instead of an outer layer. A capped number of buttons might be paired with larger, more elaborate individual pieces. Some women turned to simpler, cheaper materials shaped and set to achieve nearly the same glittering effect from a distance, forcing officials to argue over what a button was even made of before they could issue a single fine. Every time officials closed one gap, another opened somewhere else in the fine print. That endless back and forth is its own kind of shock fact. Florence did not pass one sumptuary law and consider the matter settled. Officials found themselves forced to revise, reissue, and tighten these rules again and again across the 1300s and into the 1400s. An entire legal arms race fought over hemlines, buttons, and necklines. City government against its own fashionable citizens. It is hard to think of a clearer sign that a law is failing than a government forced to rewrite it again and again against its own people. And Florence rewrote its sumptuary code more times across 2 centuries than most modern governments revise a tax law in the same span. These rules were never simply repealed. Florence kept reissuing and tightening them for generation after generation, all the way to the final years of the Florentine Republic itself. Step back and look at what this really tells us. A city willing to fund a permanent office just to count buttons on women's dresses was a city that understood clothing as a genuine threat to public order, not a trivial matter of personal taste. A pin was never just a pin in Florence. It was a small, deliberate act of political theater, sewn onto a sleeve. What does it say about a city that trusted its officials to judge threads and clasps, but never quite closed the gap they were hired to control? If a government could reach that far into a wardrobe, it should be no surprise at all that another government reached just as far into a loaf of bread and punished the baker who got it wrong in front of the whole town. Number 1. The baker's cage. In Vienna, a wooden cage hangs from the end of a long wooden beam, suspended over open water. Inside it sits a baker, hands gripping the bars, while a crowd gathers along the riverbank to watch. Someone works a lever and the cage plunges downward, dunking the man fully into the water below, then hauls him back up, only to plunge him under again. This was not mob violence breaking out in the street. This was the sanctioned, official punishment for selling bread that weighed less than the law required. Word of a scheduled dunking spread through Vienna fast, pulling in bakers' apprentices, market women, and children who had never met the man in the cage, but came anyway, drawn by the promise of a spectacle that cost nothing to watch. The practice took root in Vienna, then part of the Duchy of Austria within the Holy Roman Empire, and it appears in written records as far back as the 13th century, during the rule of Duke Ottokar II. It did not stay an informal custom for long. Duke Albrecht II gave it full legal weight, issuing a decree on the 24th of July, 1340, that formally established and sharpened the punishment for bakers caught cheating their customers. Officials weighed loaves regularly at market, checking them against a fixed standard, so that a baker who cut corners could not simply blame a bad batch of flour or plead ignorance once the scales came out against him. The law targeted something painfully practical. Bread was the single most essential food in a medieval city, and a baker who quietly shaved weight off every loaf, or used spoiled or diluted flour to cut costs, was stealing from everyone in Vienna at once, a little at a time, meal by meal. The punishment matched the scale of that betrayal. A baker caught selling underweight or substandard bread was locked into a suspended wooden cage or basket and dunked repeatedly into the water using a counterweighted lever, the same mechanism used elsewhere in Europe for scolds and cheats. The device itself was a fixture in more than one German-speaking town, a long timber arm mounted like a well sweep, built specifically so the crowd below never lost sight of the man being punished, rising and falling in full view. In some German-speaking towns that used the same punishment, the water in the basket was left anything but clean, filthy enough that the shame of it stuck to a man far longer than the cold. Here is the detail worth sitting with, because it goes further than the dunking itself. This punishment was staged deliberately in public, timed to draw the biggest possible crowd. Onlookers did not just watch quietly. They hurled stones at the caged baker and spat on him as he rose dripping from the water again and again. And this was not merely theoretical cruelty on paper. A documented case from 1550 records a baker who died during the punishment itself, drowned or crushed by the very mechanism meant to shame him rather than kill him. The city even moved the location of these punishments more than once over the years, from the old flower square to the banks of the Danube, always chasing the spot that would draw the largest, most reliably furious crowd. Sit with that shock for a moment. A punishment born from a dispute over bread weight had, by design, become mass public entertainment, complete with a body count. The law was not quietly enforced behind closed doors. It was staged like a performance, moved around the city to maximize its audience, and it could and did kill the very people it was meant to merely humiliate. A punishment meant to embarrass a cheating tradesman had, without much effort, turned into one of the most reliable free shows in the city, and city officials seemed entirely comfortable with that outcome. The cage did not disappear quickly. Vienna and other German-speaking cities kept the practice alive for centuries, carrying it all the way into the second half of the 1700s. The last documented case took place in 1773, a shockingly late date for a punishment rooted in a decree from the 1300s. It finally ended when Emperor Joseph II folded it into his broader sweep of legal reforms, closing the book on a punishment that had outlived the medieval world that invented it by centuries. For more than 400 years, a baker's worst professional mistake could still end with him soaked, bruised, and humiliated in front of half the city. A punishment that changed location and lever design far more than it ever changed in spirit. 10 laws, and every single one of them built on the same quiet truth. Medieval justice was never a shrug in the dark. It measured a cat's tail in grain, shamed a husband for his weight and his wagging tongue, mocked a shoe 2 inches too long, counted every button on a woman's dress, drowned a baker for a lighter loaf, weighed, shamed, mocked, counted, drowned. 5 verdicts, 5 entirely different ideas of what honor and guilt were supposed to look like, all of them written down, argued over, and enforced by people utterly convinced they were keeping order. That is the real strangeness worth carrying away from all 10 of these laws. Not that the medieval world was lawless, but that it was almost obsessively lawful, just according to a moral ledger that barely resembles our own. Somewhere between a cat's grave and a baker's cage, the line between justice and spectacle gets very thin indeed, and history keeps turning up stranger chapters than this one. Stay close, because the next one is already waiting.